Okay, so part two here of post-war America, we're really going to be focusing on the Korean War as an example of containment. But before we get to the Korean War, we really need to start with the Chinese Revolution, what's going on in China. Think first about how close China is to Russia. If you want to talk about the spread of communism, you might want to think about China being a logical place for communist expansion. There are two different competing political philosophies in China in the mid 40s. There's communists led by a man named Mao Zedong. That's him in the image on the bottom right. And then there are nationalists led by a man named Chiang Kai shek. That's him in the image on the left. They will actually fight each other, fight each other, fight each other, fight each other for who is going to control China in the aftermath of the war, of World War One, that is. And the nationalists actually essentially have the communists defeated. They drive them back to the mountains. It's a very brutal situation that the communists are facing. But then you have the Japanese invasion. And the nationalists will stop pursuing the communists and turn their attention to dealing with the Japanese. After World War II is over, the communists have been able to rebuild as stronger than ever and will emerge to once again challenge the nationalists. The U.S. will send aid to the nationalists, again, because they're trying to stop the spread of communism. But communists will ultimately be victorious in China by 1949. They will establish the People's Republic of China, where nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, will flee to Taiwan. Part of the reason that the communists are able to be so successful is because Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists are pretty brutal. They would move through these small rural villages, really pillaging. They would rape, they would murder, they would burn villages to the ground. Mao Zedong trained his men to move through villages in a kind way and to help to feed people who were hungry. And in that way, he gained the support of the rural population, and that's what helped him to drive the nationalists out. Not that Mao Zedong is not a brutal leader, but in this regard, he's savvy in understanding how to get people on his side. By 1950, China and Russia have a treaty of friendship and an alliance with the Soviets. The U.S. will recognize the Chinese government as existing not on mainland China, but instead in Taiwan. This is a little animation of what it's going to look like starting in 1946 and moving to 1950, and communists are the red. This is Chiang Kai-shek, or Zhang Jieshi. I'm sure I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, but also known as Chiang Kai-shek, with his wife, who are leading the Chinese government. In Japan, the United States will occupy Japan after World War II. General Douglas MacArthur will be in charge of the occupation of Japan. Their goal is to improve the economy and increase the pace of industrial recovery. They want to make sure that there is a strong Japan, just like in the West with the Marshall Plan. They're trying to ensure that there is a strong Germany. They don't want a repeat of what happened in World War I. Europe had been the first focus of the Cold War, but in the early 50s, U.S. involvement in the Korean War made East Asia the prime battleground in the long, hard Cold War struggle. The division between North and South Korea remains a source of international tension today. The focus of attention turned to the peninsula of Korea, separated from northeast China by the Yalu River. Once controlled by Japan, Korea had been divided into two independent countries by the United States and the Soviet Union after World War II. So just like they're dividing Germany, which had been controlled by obviously the Germans, into an east and a west, they divide Korea, which had been controlled by Japan, into a north and a south. And in the north, you'll have a Soviet sphere of influence, and in the south, you'll have a U.S. or an allied sphere of influence. The dividing line between the two is the 38th parallel. The Soviets will put into place a communist government and a communist military. The United States will provide aid to South Korea, but on a smaller scale. So this is what it looks like here. Korea will be divided, as I said, at the 30th parallel at the end of World War II. Will they be unified? This is the desire of the North Koreans. The communist North will invade South Korea in 1950. Southern troops will be very quickly overwhelmed. Truman will act through the United Nations, and there will be fighting. Here, let me do this first. This is what the map will look like. So you'll see, starting in 1950, going all the way up to 1953, what does the Korean Peninsula look like? So in the beginning, you will see the North move all the way down to the south, and there will be fighting in the very southern part of South Korea. Then, with UN and U.S. support, we will have a limited war, essentially, and push all the way back up north of the 38th parallel. There is a question mark here about what the U.S. will do next. Douglas MacArthur, the general in charge, wants to go all the way up to the Yalu River and invade China. This is not something Truman wants to do. He essentially is saying we need to get back to the 38th parallel and count our blessings that we made it that far and then leave. We want a limited war. Douglas MacArthur famously says there is no substitute for victory, and he wants to go all the way into China. And he does. He does not listen to Truman's command to turn around, and so Douglas MacArthur will end up being fired by Truman for disobedience. But the U.S. will sort of end the Korean War back at the 38th parallel. And when I say end the Korean War, I don't mean in the Korean War. The Korean War, the Korean conflict, is technically not even a war, is still ongoing. There's just a ceasefire. This is an image of a U.S. soldier aiming a missile while his fellow soldiers take cover during the Korean War battle, a Korean War battle. For President Truman, supporting South Korea in the Korean War was about stopping the spread of communism. Again, containment. By the spring of 1951, the Allied forces had regrouped and stabilized their position near the 38th parallel. The stalemate lasted until 1953. During that time, the two sides fought small but bloody battles with very limited results. No movement, really, is what that means. At the same time, diplomats tried to devise an acceptable peace agreement. Ongoing military exercises. This is a contemporary image between the U.S. and South Korea. Such as these, emphasize the U.S. ongoing commitment, I should say, to the safety and security of South Korea.